Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming today to our third meeting of the ACC2 and ACT Working Group. As always, thank you for your time and commitment to this effort, which I believe to be very important, and I'm very thankful to have all of you engaging. Looks like we have someone who needs to be let into the waiting room. Before we officially kind of kick off, I wanted to introduce everyone to Katie Moody, who is new in my office. She's a new special assistant, particularly for you transportation stakeholders. Katie's going to have MDOT, MDEM, and DHCD. Joe is very happy to not have to chase me down for so many things himself. So please feel free to reach out to Katie for anything that you might need in those areas or anywhere. She's also more of like a jack of all trades across the office. So another resource for all of you. I'm not going to do a ton of big opening remarks. We have a pretty packed agenda, but today we're focused on the physical infrastructure, the grid, the charging infrastructure, all of the things that we need to be running in the background in order to have a successful Clean Cars and Clean Trucks program. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our experts from MDOT and MDE who have prepared a couple of very helpful presentations for you. Anyone have any questions or comments before we jump into the presentations? And everyone on the screen, can you hear us okay? Hear me? All right, yes. Thanks, Safe. We'll roll with it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick update on kind of where we're at right now for EV infrastructure from the MDOT vantage point. We gave a little bit of an overview on this front at our inaugural meeting. So some of this is a little bit old, but with updated data.
They're saying they're not getting audio. Can we check the chat and see what's going on? Is no one hearing audio? Some people can hear.
I can hear.
Okay, so whoever can't hear, you might need to just turn up the volume on your computer. Okay.
Perfect.
We're gonna keep going. All right, go ahead, Joe. Sorry about that.
Wonderful. So on slide 2, you can see the snapshot up to date on the number of EVs registered in the state, the total growth rate between July and the end of August, as well as our charging spread throughout the state in terms of charge ports per capita. We're doing good. We're certainly seeing a little bit of an uptick that we'll cover and opportunities for continued growth. Next slide. So the Post covered this recently, but nationwide, they're expecting to see a bump in EV purchases before the big, beautiful bill thing takes effect on October 1. And so you can see here kind of our growth rate. It's trending down on a month-by-month basis since January of 2024, but we're still seeing growth. And we saw an uptick in August, and we're assuming that is in relation to the BBB taking effect on October 1. And we'll have probably similar growth or more spiky growth upwards maybe over the next month. Maybe our friends in the auto industry can tell us what's happening on their side as well. But that's our projections as we see it today. Next slide. So here's a spread of our chargers. We've got more than 1,700 public charging sites throughout the state, 4,000 public charging ports, both DC fast chargers and level 2 chargers, pretty well spread throughout the state. There's additional opportunities for growth that we'll cover in a second. Next slide. So our hallmark program is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. This is a federally funded program that the state of Maryland is implementing through FHWA. It's had a bumpy recent couple of months, but we're on the up and up. The state, led by the governor's team and our attorney general, were successful joining a coalition lawsuit to make sure that we could continue to spend our NEVI funds, which you can see here, about $63 million in total across all of the federal fiscal years where authorization exists. And we ultimately moved forward recently with a round 2 NEVI procurement that closed at the end of August. It's still too early to share much in details, but by the end of the year, we'll have a conditional award out. But we're pretty excited with the level of response that we received from the market. And I think that's important because the EV infrastructure charging system is relatively new and growing. And so, putting it on ice with the federal administration doing so, we were concerned that our procurement interest would be relatively low, but we were pretty excited with the response we had. As you can see at the bottom, we, with the second procurement, are expecting to do focus on corridor-based charging along the alternative fuel designated corridor system in the state. These are your primary interstates and highways where you're trying to make sure you've got that coverage for DC fast chargers. We expect with the next procurement, next calendar year, that we will be moving into a mix of both alternative fuel corridor, full build out, and starting to move into community charging. So these would be chargers within the community, more of your level 2, and also focused on targeting communities of need, both on demand, but also on an equity lens as well. Next slide.
Hey, Joe, can I ask a quick question about that previous slide?
Yeah.
Can you go back to that previous slide for a sec, please? How many chargers do you get per deployment? It's about the same amount of money every year. So what do you get for that investment?
Morgan, how much? We have 20 some odd sites and 120 ports coming online through round 1. Is that right?
Right. So we count it via ports. And so it really depends on where they are located in the corridor. But, I think at a minimum, the NEVI standard is 4 ports per site on the corridor. So you're looking at within those charging locations, at least being 4 ports for charging.
So if you had to ballpark the total investment, I don't know how much it costs for each one, 20 sites times 4, so what, 80?
Yeah, so we'll have 120 charge ports and roughly about 10 to 12 million in round 1 funds. And that's primarily federal with a mix of private funds that are matching those dollars. We'll see similar types of flows for this procurement as well, just simply because we're building DC fast chargers. As we move into the community, we'll be building level 2. So you'll start to see prices drop a little bit. And we'll probably have a greater growth rate at that juncture. But
And it's another 120 every year?
It depends on the response, right? So we have to do a solicitation, and ultimately that's our goal, is to fully build out the required threshold of roughly 50 miles along the alternative fuel network, no more than about a mile off the center line, and no less than 4 charge ports per investment.
But are you asking the general cost per?
I'm just asking what we get for the investment.
Yeah, so round 1, we had about 22 sites, 12 million, so roughly 540,000 per site.
Got it. Okay.
And what's exciting, we've in the background while we were delayed, if you can go to the next slide, delayed on round 2's procurement. We released it in December of 24, and ultimately we're able to close it at the end of August. Round 1, we've continued to advance, moving it items or these sites through contracts and agreements at the federal level. And we have 3 sites currently that have broken ground. We expect all 3 of these to come online before the end of the year, and the other 17 sites to all come online middle to early fall of 26. So we'll have some ribbon cuttings to do. We would love to see many of you out there with us this fall. Next slide. So this is a little dated, but I think important for folks to recognize kind of where we were at from a progress basis. In 2023, using a study from national labs, we went ahead and projected using similar types of methodology on demand and need for the state to make sure that we've got adequate charging infrastructure to meet demand. And so at the time, showing this is in 2030, kind of a growth rate goal, we were assuming that we would need roughly 5,500 charge ports for DC fast chargers in the state. And as of today, we are on pace to reach that goal. What's important to note before I flip to the next slide for level 2, where we're not at the same rate, is that conditions have changed considerably since 2023. And so both the market demand and then also public infrastructure have shifted. And we'll talk about how we're updating these projections as part of our zero emission vehicle infrastructure plan. But wanted to caveat that before you look at the next slide. So here you can see the graphics didn't carry over terribly well. We're not at the same rate. We are seeing growth year over year at a decent clip on level 2 chargers, but we're not seeing it at the rate that we would need to see if we were to hit the target projection come 2023 or 2030 of 43,000 charge ports. And, that's an opportunity for us to leverage those NEVI funds as we move into community chargers, think differently about partnerships with public, nonprofit, and private entities to make sure that we're growing. But again, we are updating these data points as part of our current zero emission vehicle infrastructure plan. Next slide. Ta-da! Which is currently in development. This is a plan that's required as part of the climate executive order. And so we are currently in final work on that front, really kind of focused in on what it can do, what it needs to do, and then ultimately how it meets demand, kind of creating the roadmap for us as a state to advance the infrastructure program. So this is a multi-agency collaborative effort with the public sector, and we love participation from the private sector. We do leverage the Zero Emission Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Committee, ZVIC, not ZVIP, for that collaboration. But I think, there's always opportunities to take this thing on the road, but also make sure that it's informed by all stakeholders as well, because it's not just looking at the private automobile, it's looking at things like truck charging for medium and heavy duty as well. And this plan is ultimately planned to be released in December or January of this year. Next slide. So what is it? Based on a recent survey, we've of 1,500 Marylanders and EV industry stakeholders. These here, this lovely colorful rainbow, are the top 10 areas of opportunity to support EV adoption in the state. We're ultimately using the takeaways from that survey and other types of inputs from the industry to develop the ZVIP. And the work group here could consider how the state in partnership with its public and private partners can ultimately influence and accelerate across these various work streams. I think one of the areas we as a state entity, I'll say this again, do a very good job of talking to each other and talking to our local government partners. Bringing in our nonprofit and our private sector partners is hugely influential and important for the success of the plan and making sure that we reach new heights. So next slide. Another item that we are planning to release this fall is a charger access and siting tool. So this is ultimately a demand-driven, opportunity-based siting tool. So if I'm a county, you can go ahead and flick up a few different layers. If you're trying to site at a multi-unit dwelling facility, you can ultimately try to target in on where you think that the demand would be best suited for chargers, whether it be registered vehicles in the state. And again, it's not to say that you shouldn't be investing in those less suitable sites, but ultimately, if you have finite resources, you're trying to leverage the opportunity as best one can. And so this will help folks be able to understand, where there's opportunity, where there's demand, and where there's maybe an equity drive to invest those dollars as well.
Can you define coming soon?
I'm working on the community data layers right now. There will be 2 siting tools, one per corridor, which, as you can imagine, is more straightforward. And then right now we're really digging in on the community layers and what makes sense and how we are looking at scaling those. So definitely the fall, I'll make sure that everyone gets access to, we're hopefully going to do at least some recorded webinars on how to use it. But we really would love to see not just our state agency partners, but community, NGO, industry use this as a helpful tool for siting.
Thank you. And then last slide. Again, a selfless plug here. You've seen this lovely graphic before. Please take out your phone, screenshot it, and schedule your time to meet with Morgan and our team on what the ZVIP is and ultimately how you can get engaged and inform its content. Again, that input is very valuable to make sure that we're indexing in the right way and ultimately being informed by our partners. So I believe as of today, we have two of these, the work group members that have taken that photo and scheduled that meeting and informed the process. I'd encourage many others to do so as well. And that's it.
Thank you. Joe, thanks for your presentation. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the reasons for the delta on level 2 chargers? You mentioned a couple things, but maybe talk a little bit more.
I'm going to have Morgan answer that because she is best suited at the technical level there.
So looking holistically, Delegate Stein, at this particular at this study that was done it was done in 2003. It's going to look more aggressive because ACC2 was rolled in, some of the tax credits were rolled in, and then that driving the vehicle deployment was also helping to drive some of the numbers related to what was needed related to the chargers. I think with level 2 is always, the market case for level 2 is often more difficult to define or to make a business model compared to DC fast charging. So when this was run in 2023, you were seeing a larger gap because the market is still figure out how to make level 2 economic. And I think that you are seeing that in there, as well as more aggressive vehicle projections that was driving the need for charging. We wanted to put this in because this was the most recent data that we had, but compared over the past year, we realized uncertainty and federal changes. So this has been a priority for us to redo those scenarios, get better data, and then we're definitely in close contact with MEA and MDE as we're working towards trying to get a better understanding. So hopefully we'll have some more fresh scenarios later this year.
No, makes sense. Thank you.
Can I also add one thing also? So I think that we obviously our EV adoption rate is going to be less. Also, the state since then has increased its investment in level 2 charging, which is not reflected there. So I think that, we'll start to see more, it's not just the NEVI chargers at level 3. The MEA has been investing in the level 2s for the last couple of years. I think, we're going to start to see that trajectory getting a lot closer to where we need to be.
Carrie, go ahead. Oh, Secretary had a question, then we'll come to you, Bill.
Thank you. On your first chart, the percentage monthly change in EV growth, I just had a few quick questions. One thing is, does industry, like the automotive industry, I know they have the same data for every state. So I'm wondering if our data is matching what they have, because they're planning just like us on these numbers. So is there any way we could figure that piece out?
Yeah.
Know the answer.
We can certainly ask our colleagues at the MBA, who this data comes from our colleagues at the auto sales side of the house. But at the end of the day, I think that we as a state might outpace certain states that maybe aren't as ambitious or have the same types of goals, policies, and incentives. But I think that this trend line would probably be semi-accurate.
Okay, so my question was, is this matching? So if it's coming from NBA, does that mean, let's say Ford, if they were looking at sales in Maryland, would they have the same number? Because we're all using the same data.
Well, Bill, tell us.
Because he said yes.
Obviously, what we have here is looking back, right? And it's a lot easier right now with all of the change kind of looming over us here in the next 3 weeks. There's a lot of uncertainty moving forward. And I don't think any of us really knows for sure what the market is going to do in a world without federal support for, EV uptake. We're in and I would certainly look to our colleagues here in the state who represent, the broader market. Our market is so small, 45,000 units this year. Next year, we're introducing a whole new product. We have ambitions for it. And the only way for us to find out is to get there. So I know that a lot of manufacturers, for better and for worse, we do our focus groups, we do our surveys, we think we know what consumers want, but until you have that physical product in real life, you don't know whether or not folks are even going to want it. Is that helpful? I don't know.
Peter, you have any thoughts?
I think the numbers, when we work with NBA, their numbers are pretty accurate.
Okay, good.
I think our experience the last 15 years has been their numbers are pretty accurate.
Right.
Individual manufacturers, we certainly could reach out and get some more data, but I'm pretty confident NBA numbers are good.
These are registrations, and
Right.
we have registration information down to the vehicle type. And so we can tell you plug-in hybrid, EV, brand, et cetera.
And this is the same I think what the secretary is asking is this the same information that the dealers are using in their planning and the manufacturers are using in their planning?
We have our own sales
This is what
every month,
the question.
but I've noticed our numbers are pretty close.
Okay.
Except for NBA, if somebody buys a car in Virginia and registers in Maryland, NBA is going to show that number.
That's right.
My sales data doesn't do that because I'm concerned about.
So that's
The only difference, but yeah, that's the difference.
Do you provide your data to anyone in the state on a regular basis?
We started sending our auto outlook every quarter to most of the legislators. We're happy to send it to everybody here. We actually started a year ago a quarterly just EV. So it doesn't have anything in there but EVs and plug-in hybrids. So I'd be happy to share that every quarter. We do it quarterly. So
Yeah, I love data. So any data that you have, I'm into it.
share that. Absolutely.
Great. Any other questions? Go ahead, Megan.
I just wanted to commend the MDOT team for the work you're doing on the ZVIP. I'm really excited about it. As you mentioned, this was one of the things the governor directed you to do in his climate executive order of last summer. I just want to say, we have a whole host of things that we've moved forward that were required in the executive order and the climate plan that all of RACE has been doing that they deserve a lot of credit for. MEA got all the grant awards for the $90 million climate down payment recently for building community electrified buildings, EV chargers, clean school buses. We have other announcements that are coming up. So good things are coming out of Maryland despite what some people may be saying, and I'm very proud of your work. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a quick question about.
Well, actually, I think Josh had his hand up.
Are we having a general discussion or is that for?
No, we have more presentation. So any other questions on this presentation specifically, and then we're going to move to the next presentation. MDE has their own presentation.
I said a quick back to the level 2 conversation for Morgan as you guys are, revisiting how you present this data. Is it possible in that next iteration to kind of have a little bit more granularity into what the unique application of the level 2 is? Like DC is so known, like we all know what that DC charging is doing, but level 2 is a lot more nebulous. And obviously this does not account for home charging. Right?
Right.
Because if we look at the first page of this, it's like, oh, there's 144,000 EVs, but we only have 13,000 chargers. Where are they all charging? Well, they're all charging somewhere.
Right.
And most of them are charging at home. And so like, as we kind of try and look forward and understand what would be the best application of funds to support adoption by deploying L2, thinking about how we can leverage the data to help us make informed decisions.
Yeah.
Kind of what I'm thinking about.
Let me, I'll have to go back to my data people.
Sure.
But I would love to continue that conversation with my staff about what types of information would be most helpful in the ZVIP as it relates to action for the state.
Thanks.
We've got a lot to cover today, so we're going to move on to MDE's presentation. Am I turning it over to Zach, Rachel, Secretary?
I can jump in. We're actually turning it over to Ben Sharp from Atlas Public Policy Consulting, who is online and who's been helping to lead, or really been leading on the consultant side, our ACT needs assessment. So Ben, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Welcome.
And Ben, we've got your slides pulled up here, so we'll be driving them.
Okay, thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Really grateful for the opportunity. While you pull up those slides, just wanted to acknowledge that Atlas Public Policy is part of a larger team, including EV Advisors, EV Noir, and the University of Maryland. But really, really pleased to have the opportunity to share some of the results that we've developed over the last several months as it relates to commercial trucks and buses and the rollout of zero emission vehicles resulting from the implementation of the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation. So let's just go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So just a quick set of contents for the slides today. First, going to give an overview of our modeling approach. And just want to also acknowledge MDE. They've been really great partners throughout this project, getting us access to other agencies and data. So just wanted to say thank you to their team and looking forward to working with them over the next couple of months as we finish up. I'm second going to talk about the vehicles that are subject to this regulation and how we expect the fleet to evolve out to 2050. Third, going to talk about what we see as the required number of EV chargers and what that will mean in terms of additional electrical capacity for the grid. And then finally, talk about what we see as being impacts to the grid in terms of overall generation needs, as well as impacts to peak loads. Next slide, please. So for our methodology, first, we were really grateful to get data from the Motor Vehicle Administration, very, very detailed. So we were able to build out a baseline understanding of the truck and bus fleet and estimate how that it's going to evolve as the regulation is implemented. Second, we estimated the energy demands from zero emission vehicles, the required number of chargers, as well as hydrogen stations, as well as the cost out to 2050. Just a quick note that I'm not including the hydrogen results as part of this presentation today, but those are included in the final report, which I'm sure that you will have access to when that's ready in a couple of months. Third, we estimate the overall impacts, as I said, to the state's electrical grid in terms of demand, generation, and impacts to peak loads. And finally, I wanted to acknowledge that we also did a few dozen stakeholder interviews across a number of different categories, including government agencies, fleets, charging service providers, and other experts. We synthesized that information on a number of different parameters. I'm not including any information that we gleaned from those conversations, but again, those will be included in the final report. Next slide, please.
Actually, Ben, I'm just going to jump in real quick. I neglected to mention that. So for the purposes of this, this presentation, we're talking about the findings of the ACC needs assessment, which is that's been in the works for a long time. It's driven by the targets that we anticipated in the under implementation of the original ACT requirements. And so, we understand that, for all the conversations we've had, future uncertain, we don't know where that's headed, but for the purposes of looking at, sort of an if-then scenario around truck deployment, these are the kinds of questions that we've been asking and will still be planning to present to the governor at the end of this year as part of that needs assessment report.
Right. And the needs assessment is extremely relevant to the infrastructure conversation because it really drives the infrastructure conversation. The needs drive how many chargers we need.
Yeah, so just wanted to avoid any confusion though. So, all right, thanks. Go ahead, Ben.
Thanks, Seth.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that additional context. Appreciate that. Next slide. So just to get an understanding of what the fleet looks like in the state. So here we have the number of vehicles that we estimate would be subject to the Advanced Clean Trucks rule. And just to emphasize, this isn't the full universe of commercial trucks and buses. So for example, it does not include transit buses, emergency response vehicles, and there's some other carve-outs in terms of vehicle types that would not be subject to the regulation. So this is just the vehicles that we estimate would be subject to ACT. So looking at the graph on the left-hand side, so we have the classes of vehicles going from lighter to heavier. So class 2Bs and 3s are the smallest vehicles in this sector. So think your Ford F-250s, your Sprinter vans. And as you move to the right up to class 8, the vehicles get larger in terms of their size and their application. So up to class 7 and 8 are typically like your tractor trailers, your largest freight vehicles, your trash trucks, those types of vehicles. So as you can see in the figure, the fleet is really dominated by those smaller pickup trucks and vans. They make up, over 60% of total vehicles in the state. And when you look at the right-hand side of the slide, that figure there gives you a little blow up of the bottom portion of the left-hand plot. And you can kind of see how the vehicles are segmented in terms of the types of vehicles. We have lots of straight trucks, which are in dark blue. So the vehicles where the cargo carrying the back part of the vehicle is permanently attached to the front part of the vehicle, which we call a straight truck. You can see the other vehicle types in terms of vans, school buses, and as you go to the class 7 and 8, you start to get your tractor trailers, which are shown in pink there, and then also a small amount of refuse trucks as well. So, but yeah, the take-home message here is that there are just a lot of very light vehicles, very small pickup trucks and vans that really dominate the fleet in terms of numbers. Next slide, please. So looking at the fleet and how we expect it to evolve over time as we implement the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation. So you can see kind of the breakdown in terms of the vehicle classes. As I mentioned, the smaller class 2B and 3 vehicles really dominate the fleet. But you can also see you have the internal combustion vehicles, as you would expect, their population going down over time. And around 2040 is kind of the inflection point where you have zero emission vehicles start to make up the majority of the overall fleet. And that only accelerates as you move out to 2050. Next slide, please. So just a note on terminology. So we kind of simplified the universe of where chargers can go and came up with this classification strategy for our modeling. So the first one is home or public residences, which is just as it sounds. In that, especially the smaller classes of vehicles, so your Ford F-250s, those types of vehicles, as we all know, quite popular in terms of personal transportation. So lots of those vehicles, the majority actually reside at public residences, private residences. The second classification are depots. So these are vehicles that return to the same facility, whether it's a parking facility or some type of warehouse. They're domiciled at the same place every day. And then finally, we have the kind of the catch-all category for any vehicles that are not charging at kind of a central location every day. So this is primarily vehicles that are doing long distance travel. So think your tractor trailers that are doing interstate type of operations and don't necessarily come back to the same place every night. So we call that segment en route. So those are the three: home, depot, and en route. The next slide, please. So getting into the results of what we expect the number of charging ports to be over time, you can kind of see as you accelerate out to 2050 that the number of ports that we expect to be required becomes fairly substantial, getting up to around 170,000 ports we expect to be needed out to 2050. But one of the things that we think is quite interesting, quite important in the results is that a large, the majority of these ports, roughly 90%, we feel can be low power chargers, so L2 type of chargers. And coming back to this point where the large majority of vehicles are smaller, so your class 2B and 3 vehicles. So for even some of the other classes of vehicles, your class 4 or 5 trucks, we think that given the operations, given low mileage, we think that level 2 would be sufficient to power a lot of those vehicles. But as we get into the next slide, in terms of the overall cost though, we can really see that the en route chargers are really driving the overall cost picture out to 2050. So as you can imagine, these en route chargers are primarily serving the larger trucks. So your tractor trailers that are large in size and in terms of energy and power needs really demand a lot. So these are your high power chargers that typically have a pretty large price tag associated with them. So as you install more and more of those chargers out to 2050, en route charging starts to quickly dominate the overall cost picture out to 2050. And we estimate overall the price tag would be a bit over $4 billion for all the infrastructure associated with building out the network to support zero emission trucks and buses. Next slide, please. So thinking about what are the impacts to the overall electricity grid, definitely want to acknowledge our friends at the University of Maryland who helped us with this particular modeling. They have a sophisticated tool. They're able to model the entire grid and how it would respond to additional demands. And so when we plug in the ACT requirements, this is what the model gives us in terms of additional electricity generation in the state. As you can see in the stacked area chart, the model expects that imports would play the majority of meeting that additional demand. So generation would be really dominated by imports, but you also have a small sliver of renewables as well as natural gas plants that would be needed. And in terms of overall increase in terms of generation in the state, we estimate that out to 2050, it would be about 5% additional electricity generation needed. Next slide, please. And finally, looking at what we expect to be the impact to overall peak loads. So as you may know, when planning for the electrical grid, utilities and utility regulators, peak loads are really kind of a key metric that we have to consider in terms of the overall grid system and resiliency. So you can see kind of over time, as we would expect, the impacts grow. Starting off at very modest in 2030 when the regulation would be fairly young, growing to what we expect to be up to about 2.5% in 2040. And then finally out to 2050, if the full ACT were implemented, we would expect up to about a 6% increase in the overall peak loads in the state. So order of magnitude would be similar in terms of the generation needs. So I believe that's my last slide. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity. I've listed my email there if you have any detailed questions. But thank you, much appreciated.
Thank you so much. Any questions for Ben? Joe?
Slide 5, trying to get a sense, is that the assumption with federal subsidies and grants as well as ACT in place, or is that projected without it? And if projected with yesteryear's inputs, like what would this chart presumably look like in today's state?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we more or less simplified the modeling by just imposing a certain uptake of zero emission vehicles exactly per the requirements of the ACT regulation. So we more or less assumed that whatever the forces, the external market forces and policy mechanisms that are in place, we just assumed, okay, the fleet is going to follow this trajectory to the number. So we have other analysis that our partners did looking at kind of the universe of policy mechanisms, incentives, both fiscal and non-fiscal. So a very comprehensive look at all the policies that are available to the state to spur the market along. But our modeling exercise in particular just assumed kind of a straight one-to-one uptake of the regulation as it was designed.
Thanks. This is Ben with the Maryland Public Service Commission. Pages 4 and 7, you're giving breakdowns of numbers of vehicles and types of chargers. I'm trying to understand how much of that is in service of, I guess, transient, medium and heavy duty, where they're passing through the state. They don't really have a home base in state, versus how much of that is made up of they're trying to get from point A to point B in state every day. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. So if you recall, and perhaps we can move to that slide where we showed the cost breakdown from depot, home, and en route, where en route starts to make up the majority of the cost profile out to 2050. Yeah, thank you. There it is. So en route chargers are primarily serving those transient vehicles, to your point, that don't have a home base, largely coming in and out and often through the state, but not necessarily domiciled in the state. So these are vehicles that may not be registered in Maryland. Most of them are not. So it's quite a substantial percentage of your overall cost portfolio would be dedicated to those vehicles that are just transient and looking for a fill up while they're in the state of Maryland. Great question.
Thanks. I guess part of that, and this might be for later discussion, is trying to understand, like depots, private residents. I have a business directly that when they say I need something, they can work with the utility to get the infrastructure they need in place, versus this en route. That feels more like a moving target from a planning perspective, trying to figure out where is best to put that infrastructure to serve the need and when it should go into place.
Yeah, absolutely. We modeled those chargers as being kind of a truck stop type of experience. We did not do any detailed kind of financial business, modeling for the stations themselves, but, based on what we're seeing in California and some other states, those are almost exclusively being developed by kind of third party type of depots. So they're just more or less kind of setting up these kind of truck stop type of facilities where they're not dedicated to one or even a few different fleets, that they're more or less designed to kind of be public facilities where anybody can stop or reserve a spot to get a charge. So, but yeah, to your point, these would not be facilities that are owned by one fleet or a couple of fleets. These would almost exclusively be owned and operated by these third-party type of depot type of operators.
Thank you.
One more question to Ian.
This is Ian at MEA. One question I have is, a lot of these chargers, I know this modeling was for the medium heavy duty truck space. We just heard a presentation from Joe at MDOT about light duty. And I guess my question is, are all of these ports additional to what would be required for light duty fleet? Because it seems like a lot of this is overlapping infrastructure. And so I just want to understand how much of this is an addition and versus how much of it is overlapping. And then we have to try to understand modeling both sets of vehicle types together to understand what our real infrastructure needs are.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And this is additional modeling based on what we would estimate would be needed just by the class 2B through 8 vehicles. So, yes, this would be additional charging that's needed over and above what's needed for passenger vehicles. But the caveat is that a large percentage, so roughly 90% of the charging, we think could be covered by those L2 type chargers that, this is more or less chargers that could serve both commercial vehicles as well as light duty vehicles. So, those Ford F-250s, for example, those are the types of vehicles that we're talking about, and those could be served by, chargers that are very common for the light duty space, of course. So, but yeah, just to be clear, this is additional over and above the passenger vehicle space.
Right. Thank you very much for that presentation again, Ben. Extremely helpful and informative. We are going to move into our first discussion on infrastructure. We have 3 lead discussants. I'm going to ask you each to please keep your remarks as tight as possible while still saying everything that you want to say, just because I want to make sure we have lots of time for discussion. But Ramon, Lewis, and Nada have each prepared remarks or a presentation. So I'd like to call on Ramon first to do his presentation or remarks.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentations, great presentations. I have not prepared a slide, but I have some remarks, right? We have seen the level of the magnitude that we need to deploy in terms of charging infrastructure. We need thousands of chargers to accommodate for the projections in order to meet our climate goals. I guess for me, the question about that is how are we making sure that those chargers serve Maryland's equitably? Don't choose winners and who's not going to benefit from those charging stations. There's a number of programs already in the state, Navy, CVIP, CV pilot programs, electric school buses, and so on. But the question, once again, and this is again my entry point here, my point of view is from equity distribution of those programs. How do we ensure that they are distributed equitably? You mentioned, MDOT, the Department of Transportation, that tracker that with a number of indicators. So one of the questions that I posed the group, I posed for discussion is, how do we ensure that, those trackers, the same way they talk about affordability, access, take into consideration overburdened communities? How can bring some co-benefits in terms of not just access to charging infrastructure, but also reducing emissions in the places, overburdened communities where are most overburdened by pollution and things like that. So that's kind of the questions. How do we, as we move forward and implement those programs, what are those provisions that really address an equitable distribution of charging infrastructure? And secondly, how can we engage community members to really bring those benefits, the benefits that they see that more address their needs? And again, we have, during the presentations, we have identified affordability, access. So how can we ensure that those programs really address those? And the last one is, of course, rural inclusion. It's a different situation, different conditions, different characteristics, and what are the solutions that really address infrastructure in those areas?
Thank you, Ramon. I think that was a great way to start this discussion because the equity considerations are really, really important. Environmental justice is something that's very important to the governor and to the administration, making sure that we are not continuing to harm communities that have experienced a lot of environmental injustice, and also making sure that policies that we put in place are keeping equity in mind. So I think that was a great way to open. Thank you for that. Louis, I'm going to come to you next.
So I do have some slides. They're very brief, and I put my remarks on paper to make sure I didn't deviate. So just, the data that you see in the slides that I have was developed by Roland Berger in 2024, and it really was designed around, how do we build out infrastructure to allow for the adoption of, zero emission trucks. There is a lot of data in what are 4 or 5 slides. I will just highlight the most significant findings in that data. And I think it's also important to note that this is based on current technology as of last year. They did forecasting based on projected advancements in technology that are not here. But if you can look at slide 2, right, just to sort of highlight some of the things that they looked at, right? They identified really 2 types of charging locations. And I'm glad that a lot of what Ben said supported what Roland Berger had done, which really is on-site, AKA terminal charging, or en route, which we would consider to be highway charging, right? And I think what you find, it really looks at where might they be installed, what types of charging is necessary, whether that be private charging, whether that be shared charging hubs, or something that would require full public access. What I think is most encouraging, and again, I'm glad that Ben's data supports this data, about this finding is that overwhelmingly for local charging needs, you find that level 2 or level 3 charging is sufficient. And that DC fast charging really becomes much more necessary when you get to highway locations. So that's kind of the takeaway from that particular slide. On slide 3, trucking is very diverse. We call trucking universal for anyone who operates a heavy duty vehicle, but in reality, the operations are so distinct and that use case varies widely. So what Roland Berger did is they really divided things into medium duty and heavy duty. And they looked at local medium duty, low mileage, local medium duty, high mileage, and then heavy duty local and heavy duty long haul. And I think one of the really meaningful aspects of this is that if you look at medium duty, local, low mileage, that's 93% of the medium duty industry, right? And that should be our easy target. I mean, that's just the reality, right? That's on-site or depot charging locations, right? Medium duty, local, high mileage is just 7% of the industry, right? And so while those can predominantly be charged on site, there is some on-route charging that may be necessary, at least under current technology. And then when you start to get into the heavy duty market, both from a local and a long haul standpoint, it's about an even split, right? It's 49 to 51%. That charging looks dramatically different, whether that be on-site, depot, or on route, or if you needed charging at a truck stop location. So just keep that in mind kind of as we continue this discussion. And then moving to slide 4. So this is really just a general summary based on vehicle size, the types of charging, the kinds of site improvements that are likely needed, what type of electrical service is necessary. And I think it reinforces that higher capacity charging is needed for heavy duty, and that those upgrades, are much more significant than what you might find for medium duty, where on-terminal charging is likely to be the easiest to install and the most cost effective. And so then just kind of one final point on the last slide, because I know we're tight on time. I put a list of questions together for part of the discussion. Certainly don't need me to read them, but the big takeaway, right, is that we have to have a reliable on-route charging system for high mileage vehicles can electrify. But there is a dramatic segment of the industry, particularly the medium duty industry, that doesn't run those types of miles that would require that type of investment. And that's really our low hanging fruit, right? And then there are a series of questions, about where should we focus our resources? Should it be public or private? What's the role of the OEMs? We've seen how Tesla built out its own charging network, right? So engaging the OEMs in network development, right? And truthfully, what is the impact of subsidies on fleet decision-making relative to whether or not to adopt these vehicles? I think that is really undetermined. I'm certainly here in Maryland where the adoption is, very minimal at this point in time. But there are a lot of opportunities here, I think, that we should explore and talk about. And I'll stop there, Shane.
Thank you very much, Louis. Appreciate that. We're going to hold on questions so we get to the discussion. Joe, I see you just itching to jump in. You'll have your chance. Nada, we're going to come to you and then we will jump into our discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much. My name's Nada Delany. I'm an attorney at the Environmental Defense Fund. I'll talk a little bit about medium heavy duty vehicle needs and then equity largely. A lot of it has been covered in great detail. But I think what I want to echo is really the flexibility and gradual nature of the Clean Car Truck rules that are allowing these kinds of more easier to electrify segments like those class 2B3 vehicles, the ones with long dwell times and depots, they're staying local to where they are overnight, for example, are the easiest to electrify and what we should be prioritizing first, especially given the disproportionate contribution to pollution these vehicles have, given that they are in urban areas where people live and work and go to school. Also, the benefits of being able to use level 2 for these vehicles. It's great for the grid in managed charging and load management, as well as kind of sharing costs in a shared charging matter. And then as well that the 2B vehicles of particular size, considering can also use the light duty public charging infrastructure. On that note, for public charging infrastructure, it was noted that the number of public ports we need, of course, doesn't reflect home charging needs, And I think that's a big takeaway for me on what kind of public education is needed to tell people about how easy it is to charge at home if that's something you have access to. It's certainly the most convenient and affordable, and it's going to be the vast majority of use. People who have access to home charging probably won't need public charging the vast majority of the time, right? And then from there, when we're trying to grow EV adoption, a lot of people that have probably been more hesitant thus far are going to be people who do not have home charging. Maybe they live in multifamily homes, they're renters, and they don't want to invest in that, a home that they may not own. So I think it's important to keep up the charging infrastructure for home charging as adoption grows. So that means things like a robust EV-ready building code for multifamily homes and single-family homes, and building just to save money on retrofitting for later use, and also that equity and accessibility for folks who don't need to have like an electrician on call, for example, to be able to install things. And just that the benefits that I talked about for medium heavy duty as well, where it's not a high power need, and you're able to take advantage of the benefits of EVs like load management and flexible load and things like that. I think we talked about filling in the gaps from what the market is not investing in and NEVI. I think level 2 in particular, and then in abundant numbers at community levels, is going to be really important. It's the most affordable way to charge, and certainly if you have one in your neighborhood, you can charge and go home. We kind of get the same benefit of people who have home charging who take 10 seconds to charge, so to speak. You're plugging in, going to sleep, and waking up full. So I think that's a really important thing to stress. That people who live in multifamily homes, often with the least privilege compared to single family homeowners, deserve that same equitable access and affordability to charging, including fair electrical rates, right to charge from landlords and homeowners associations, and also echoing just this encouraging of small businesses or nonprofits in community areas, as well as local governments who might have fleet electrification goals to host level 2. Small businesses getting more business from customers, and nonprofits serving their community. And again, that pollution impact, again, the most disproportionately. And that's where you get the most savings from. So that's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely agree with all of that. And one thing that I was thinking about while you were speaking is, definitely relevant in Baltimore, but in other places too. Do people know that even if you live in a row home and don't have a driveway, that you could have an EV and you could charge it at home? And what does that process look like in different areas of the state? If I live in a row home in Baltimore, what are my options for charging? Can I install it right there in front of my house? People probably don't know. I live in Baltimore and I don't know. So I think that that's something too, is getting an understanding of what the local rules are, the local zoning or whatever the local rules are that govern this. And understanding how complicated they are, and if there is a level of education that needs to happen, even to the governments themselves, about how their policies are impeding maybe their own goals around EV adoption and things like that. Okay, we're going to open it up for discussion. Josh, I see your hand. I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, thank you. As Netta mentioned, addressing equity often really requires addressing market failures where the market's not providing charge. And here, if you want to hand that out for a second. The federal funding and MDOT's role is critical in this regard. And so I wanted to ask, as my big question, what would MDOT need to accelerate its implementation and rollout of charging? When I look at, I really want this to be, as sort of constructive as possible. I was looking for a comparison to how MDOT was doing versus other states, and Pennsylvania provided a comparison. And when I look at just government stats on February 6th of 2025, so, over 3 years into NEVI, MDOT had spent $28,000 out of $49 million available. And then when I look at what the status of physical charging infrastructure is that's been funded by NEVI, in the summer of 2025, MDOT sent out a tweet that showed that they've finally started building or digging up the first NEVI charger. And if I looked at Pennsylvania, they've already had 13 or 14 charging stations operating. Every one of those blue stars or blue diamonds is an additional charging station that's operating. So I was struck by this and I thought to myself, like, what is it that MDOT needs? Is it more empowerment? Do you need more staff? Is it that you need red tape cut? I know that, Governor Moore and Governor Shapiro often work together, and Governor Shapiro had this op-ed after his, I-95 overpass disaster where they had to shut down 95. And he wrote this op-ed and said, this is how we rebuilt a highway bridge in 12 days. And he talked about empowering agencies and cutting, basically cutting red tape. So is that what, like, I would love to know what could be of assistance?
Just really, I want you to answer that question, but just really quick on the Josh Shapiro Bridge, because that comes up a lot, the rebuild in 12 days. That was a temporary bridge that they had to come back later and do all the work for.
Okay.
So I just want to make sure everybody knows that. Like, it's a great talking point, and he absolutely did get a bridge back up in 12 days. My understanding is that that was a temporary structure. It was like a one-lane bridge, and that they had to come back on the back end and do all the things. Is that right, Joe?
It's a little wider than that. It was 95, but yes, it was a much smaller asset than what we're dealing with the Key Bridge for sure.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure, because I hear that a lot as like a comparison to the Key Bridge, and it's just not at all.
That's super helpful.
Yeah.
So, but looking at their build out of NEVI, are there lessons that we could import from Pennsylvania, or is there something, we could get you more resources, or what would it look like?
So there's a couple things that, one, leadership matters, right? And hats off to the team over here. We've got committed leaders. When we came in, I think the inflection point was the previous administration had a new program that is not normal from a federal highway or a highway building context, right? All of a sudden we have federal funds trying to build a new asset class that we've never ever touched before with new federal regulations that, like, literally our state highway administration folks that know how to do pavement very, very, very well just sat there and said, I don't know how to do this. And some of them may or may not have said, well, if we don't touch it, can we just give the money back, right? And that wasn't a position that we as a state government were going to take, right? So when we got there, we were fortunate not to have the leaders from the second floor, but also, when Secretary Wiedefeld at the time, said ramp up a team and get going. So we brought in Darren Lovas from NRDC. We're very, very, very fortunate to have Morgan join us recently from US DOE. And, we've hit the ground running. I cannot commend Administrator Pines more on this subject. Like, literally came in, I don't know if it was August or September. By October, we had a game plan and team in place in 2024, and we had a procurement on the street in January 23, 24, 25. We put out that procurement in January, had our funds partially committed for round one in July of last year. And unfortunately, the federal process to move things through from there on out just takes time, right? Because you also have private partners doing this for the first time. You have public sector partners doing it for the first time. Commitment and sustained commitment and predictability from the federal partner has shot us in the foot on round two. But I think, when we talk about it, there's newness of a program that's a challenge, and certain states basically said, that's fine, we're going to go solve it and run right at it. And I would commend PennDOT and Governor Shapiro's willingness to do that. I don't think that our predecessor had the same focus nor the drive to do it. And I think leadership matters. We were playing catch up, but we also, in a new program, we're able to learn from mistakes of those that got out ahead of us. And I think, course correct. So we're not going to be making the same mistakes. So that's where I'd say money matters, predictability, and focus matters. I think the most exciting thing and the biggest challenge for us as we look out to what's next is how in the heck are we going to do community charging at scale, right? We've got $30-ish million. We can put it in a lot of different places. We can certainly do layers around, rural focus or equity focused or EJ focus. But this is, we've solved the AFC alternative fuel corridor conundrum, figured out how to procure it, and are ultimately complying with federal requirements. The next frontier is like, all right, we just learned that. Now we got to go ahead and up our game just a little bit more to do the next thing. And that's exciting for me and for my team that's on the phone here. Like, that's going to be lesson learned to any and all lessons that you guys have, that you see good examples from our peers from other states that might be just a little bit ahead of us. But I think the gap that you see here is not as real today as it was, a couple of years ago.
But Josh, your point is extremely relevant. Like, everything needs to go faster. Have you all met Westmore? Faster. Everything faster. So we definitely hear you, and I definitely want to see if there are opportunities for this particular program to move faster. I actually messaged Katie during this meeting and said, you should get with Joe and see if there's a way to make this go faster. So we're on the same page.
Can I ask one follow-on question?
Sure.
So as of June this past, at the beginning of the summer, Maryland is benefited from a temporary federal court order that's protecting its money. Other states rushed ahead to obligate the remaining block, which I think is around $30 million now remaining for Maryland. Maryland hasn't done that yet, which means that if they lose this case, they could lose that $30 million. So my question is Maryland going to rush ahead and try and obligate that money like Colorado and Washington State did, so that it's not in your coffers, but it's locked down? Because right now it's sort of vulnerable to however that judge.
I think that we don't feel the vulnerability, but we are in active conversations with the Federal Highway Division Office on what can be done. Block obligating is not necessarily a legal thing within, USC 23 CFR. That said, we're in active conversations to see if it's a possibility within our state and our construct. So.
Stephanie, I think you had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So I help coordinate the governor's federal investment team that focuses on all the federal money we got under the IRA and the IIJA. And I'm just also going to say on the CPRG funds, we've received 2 different grants as part of other multi-state grants. One is being implemented by DNR that focus on more resiliency-led projects was led by the Carolina states. And then one you referenced here, it was a New Jersey-led grant to do heavy-duty EV charging along the I-95. I know that you guys are getting started on that. And I'm sure Morgan and Darren, if you want to set up a time to talk to them about how that's being set up, they can tell you more about it.
That's super helpful. One thing to know is that CFI is frozen under the Trump administration, but Attorney General Brown could file federal litigation to unfreeze that money like Maryland did for NEVI. So right now that the CFI funds are frozen, but the ability to unlock that is going to be dependent on filing.
Josh, you should get with Megan on that, and she can maybe take that back to our attorneys. We have a team of attorneys, and also the OAG has a whole subsection that's dealing just with all the federal issues. So we can take it back to them and see if there are any opportunities there.
Thanks.
Go.
I just wanted to jump up and down on a point that Lewis made in his presentation, and kind of as, the state and its leadership thinks about how we can both continue to spur adoption of these products and to, positively impact EJ communities, like, look for low-hanging fruit. We are going to be the first people to tell a prospective customer if our product is not right for them. EVs are not right for every application right now. That's like, let's just call it. And it's everything gets a lot easier. But, looking at the stat here from this presentation, 93% of medium duty implementations are local and can be easily addressed, on-site, oftentimes behind the fence infrastructure. And so my point in raising this is simply that it's really easy in the kind of governmental sector to seek out, really sexy, really splashy partnerships. And if you want to make progress, just look for people who are raising their hands and are ready to do it. And that's going to get you enough momentum with the funding that we have available to make meaningful progress and hopefully kind of push the market in the direction that we want it to go. So for what that's worth, I think it's just we can just lose ourselves chasing the corner cases. Just look at who's sitting in front of us and let's go for it.
I guess to that point, though, I guess this is what I wanted to ask about. I'm looking at the heavy duty class 7 and 8, and the point that we had a whole presentation talking about basically transient charging is going to be the expensive, hard thing to solve. It sounds almost like I need to count on other states, though, also
doing a lot of electrification effort for any of that to materialize. So I guess from a next 5 to 10 year perspective, are you recommending that maybe we need focusing more on this mediums class 3 to 6 class? Because 7 to 8 is not going to really materialize until the trucking industry sees a whole corridor worth of DCF available to them?
Yeah, it's getting closer, right? Because of the work that Pennsylvania has done. So at least you have that connection between Maryland, and Pennsylvania. I'm not sure what's happening down in Virginia.
So I don't disagree with you, Shayna, but the numbers are astronomical, right? Both from a cost standpoint and the number of chargers that are being put in. I'm not saying that Maryland shouldn't invest in some, what I'll call highway charging or truck stop charging, but you're talking about dozens for thousands of trucks that are, Maryland is a pass-through trucking state. You asked the question about transient, right? Those locations are charging out-of-state trucks. They're not charging Maryland trucks. And so if you really want to charge, and encourage adoption amongst Maryland vehicles, you would be looking much more at the medium duty than the heavy duty side.
So Megan touched on a couple of grants that I think, and the way I might be wrong and Morgan might kick me, but the market is a little bit more not as mature on medium and heavy duty yet, right? I think we understand the opportunity, but who's doing it well, it's still TBD, but we do have opportunities with federal funds to dip our toes in, and not just like in a small way, but in a significant way that we might learn and grow together. And so on the long haul, we've got opportunities on the I-95 corridor with that grant that you touched on in terms of stretching from Maryland up to Connecticut and trying to build a corridor where the long hauls can charge. I think the other one to watch in this state is a Clean Ports grant that we received that's going to enable us to do depot-based charging for that medium truck traffic around the port, which I think has a lot of benefit also for the EJ component in the communities that are near the port. But I think those two with, Josh, to your point on CFI, we're not going to let that go. It's going to show up in our coffers someday soon. But we're going to be looking at various types of tests. And I think working, collaboratively, which we always do, learn, grow, and hopefully, with our friends at MEA and MDE also incent and encourage and grow together. We're going to need some help from PSC on the grids because these are big energy consumers, but it's an opportunity. So we've got the right people at the table. We're going to be able to do some work.
Sure.
I had for everyone else that hasn't had their ZVIP conversation, I had a lovely ZVIP conversation with Morgan and staff yesterday. And this was one of the points I ended up talking about is, where there are federal funds to focus on these types of corridors, Maryland should absolutely do it, spend that money. But where we're talking about state money, it's going to be better used serving other potential users than, out-of-state truckers. And just even if we look at what's on Lewis's slide deck here, 49% of class 7 and 8 usage here in the state is still local. We shouldn't have to worry about infrastructure for those folks in public settings. They're going to be charging behind the fence somewhere else. And so there's still room for the state to support those types of endeavors, and they absolutely should if funding permits. But focusing, that is much lower hanging fruit than trying to project how some trucker from New Jersey is going to come through Maryland and focus on the easy stuff first.
Can you give me an example as the least knowledgeable person here on the subject? What exactly is a 7 or 8? Give me an example of what kind of truck that is. A semi, okay, like a regular tractor trailer, big guy.
Or like dump trucks or.
Okay, the big.
But yes.
Okay.
Think of box trucks as everything up to class 6 for the most part. There are larger box trucks.
Got it. So a regular size box truck is the highest medium duty.
Yeah, there are larger box trucks that would be in the class 7 category.
Got it. Okay.
But yes, that's
super helpful.
An easy way to think of it.
Sorry, I'll learn. Delegate.
Thank you, Shayna. I sort of agree with the point that's been made that to the extent that if we want to, in the end, make recommendations on allocation of scarce state dollars for charging, that the local market where 93% of those vehicles, the driving distance does not exceed the usable range of a battery electric vehicle. I think that makes sense. I'm also curious to know if that would move the market in that category, because my understanding is still the price differential between EVs, even in category 3 through 6, is substantially bigger than it is for the passenger fleet. So I'd be curious to know if we said, okay, yeah, let's focus on the low vehicles. Would that move the needle in terms of market adoption?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer to it, right? I mean, you're exactly right, Delegate, that, you know, and the one thing I will say is the price differential is lower amongst those size vehicles than it is amongst a traditional tractor trailer combination, right? And so, you know, absolutely. And the charging infrastructure needs are also less, so that cost isn't as high also.
And one of the big challenges is simply, it's the work of getting the infrastructure set up. So whatever, you know, this group can recommend to the state, DOT, to help streamline those processes. If you're a, you know, pick your poison of what type of fleet operator you are, you've got 100 delivery vans. If I want to electrify 10 of them, how much effort is it going to take for me to build out that infrastructure? Is that simply just more work than it's worth? And I don't feel like it. I'll just get 10 new gas ones and it's fine.
So I actually have a connection at BGE who manages their fleet. If that would be an interesting conversation to have, we could see about getting a presentation. You can let me know if you think that'd be helpful.
You know, one thing I'll add, I agree with everything that's been said. But one thing I wanted to add to it is that the beautiful thing about depot charging, which is what everyone's talking about here, is that it falls into that category of charging that uses our grid more efficiently and effectively, because typically it's overnight, right? So it's not coincident with peak energy demand. So it doesn't drive up peak energy demand. It has a much lower burden on our grid. And what that does is it means that the state can invest in that charging infrastructure and interconnecting it. And that will actually drive down not just the EV owner's energy costs, but every electricity owner's energy costs, because you're using the existing grid more efficiently and effectively. So that is the best, lowest hanging fruit in a number of ways.
I have one other question. So we're talking a lot about the number of vehicles and the types of charging infrastructure necessary. But I think another thing that we shouldn't lose sight on is the mileage that those vehicles drive. How much of it is in Maryland, right? Because the reason we're doing this at the end of the day, right, is about trying to reduce air pollution, right? Meet both, you know, climate for sure, but also, you know, other associated pollutants. And so I think that we should also be thinking about how we can get some of those, the most mileage electrified, the quickest, the cheapest, and think about those infrastructure needs as well as, you know, what is easiest and low hanging fruit.
Ian, that is a good point. Look, I'm not a denier. I'm not going to sit here and say that class 7 and class 8 aren't more polluting than class 3 to class 6. They are. I know that, right? But, you know, they are the hardest ones to get to electrification. And so, you know, I think one of the challenges, and this might tie a little bit to your point, Tosh, also to think about on the lower sized vehicles or the lower weight vehicles, sometimes those miles aren't significant enough to justify, to your point, Delegate, the cost differential. For example, I'm thinking about a household goods mover, right? A household goods mover who is moving your items from one address to another. Most of their time is not driving. Right? If I come to your house, I load your goods onto my truck, I drive to your new residence, and I'm thinking about local moves again, right? So in state, and now I'm spending hours offloading your goods and setting your furniture up, right? So that makes it a lot more difficult to justify the investment in an electric vehicle because it's not running the miles where I get that recovery necessarily on fuel savings and things like that. So those are all factors, but I guess my point is that operationally, the industry sector has to determine what works for it and what doesn't, right? We need to make sure that the availability of a company that wants to invest has access to the resources so it can put in charging infrastructure that allows it to do that. They still got to decide if it works for them, right? So that's the key.
I wonder if it'd be helpful to hear from some of the other manufacturers who are not on the committee, maybe just have them come in and do presentations. That sound helpful?
Or fleet owners.
Fleet owner, right, yeah, I was saying my friend at BGE.
Well, on that point, I mean, so we're talking about infrastructure, but then always I'm like, before we get to the infrastructure, I need to know somebody's buying the equipment or I have a bunch of useless infrastructure in the ground. So ACC, ACT were kind of those spurs to help make sure the inventory was there of vehicles, kind of what you were getting to there. What, I guess, does the industry view as a positive, either whether it be government or non-government, and like to make sure that that inventory is available for those fleets that want to do it? Have you all thought a little bit about that with the loss of ACC or ACT possible?
So I actually believe that any trucking company that wants to get an electric truck, that an OEM that provides an electric vehicle will find a way to get them that vehicle. You know, I understand we talked a lot about market penetration and things with ACT. I believe that if you want to buy one, that OEM is going to get you one, right? Because if not, they'll find an OEM that will.
Any last thoughts here before we take a quick break for our next section? All right, very good. It's 1:23. We will reconvene at 1:30 for the final section. We may have to condense it a little bit. This has been a great discussion, but we are a little behind schedule. So let's just be quick about our break and see you back in a few minutes. Hello there, screen team. Thanks for your patience. We are going to jump back in with a presentation from the PSC on grid impacts, readiness, and rate structure. We're a little short on time. If you could kindly try to keep your presentation to 15 minutes, that would be great. If we need to continue the discussion at the beginning of our next meeting, we can absolutely do that.
Yeah, definitely can do that. All right, so, hi, my name is Ben Baker. I'm a Senior Commission Advisor at the Maryland Public Service Commission. So today I'm going to be talking with you about effectively grid planning and rates for electric vehicles. And the two actually are not mutually exclusive, and how you set rates actually has an influence on infrastructure build out, which is important. So the first slide, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. There's a pretty picture in the appendix for you to look at if you're more of a visual learner. But effectively, this is just a quick breakdown of the electric grid and how we think about things, supply, that's your generation, solar, nuclear, gas, coal. Transmission, that's the big wires to get the energy from those big power plants to our local distribution companies. And then there's the distribution companies who take that power from those bigger wires and get it to your houses. That's a simple way of thinking about this. There's also bi-directional flow, which EVs could be playing a part in, but we won't get into that right now. But effectively, the way to think about it is, from a planning perspective, we need to ensure that there's enough supply and enough network to instantaneously meet the customer's demand within reasonable parameters. We, the Maryland Public Service Commission, and what the state can influence more heavily is that distribution network and the generation that might be attached to that distribution network. Where we have a little less authority is the supply and transmission aspect of it, which is overseen by federal entity called FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and we are part of a 13-state market overseen by an entity called PJM, who deals with the development and operation of the supply and transmission assets and how that is sent out. So what does this mean for EVs? That's the next page on page 3. So issues from grid planning perspective for EVs are the same that would come from any addition of load, especially in the electrification push the state is pursuing. And basically, and this was already kind of alluded to earlier, from a grid planning perspective, I am usually most concerned with peak management. So I swear a picture would be great, but imagine a bell curve, which is not exactly how the load is, but at the top of that bell curve is when all the devices on the grid are plugged in at the same time. It is a lot more expensive for me to serve an electron at that peak of that bell curve than it is to serve it in the wings. The more I can do to encourage use of the grid in those wing hours, the cheaper it will be and the less the structure I will need to develop to serve that load. And that's the kind of things that we at the Maryland Public Service Commission and through our utilities would be concerned about and where we need to focus our efforts. And so as we increase this deployment of EVs and other infrastructure, I want to be clear that you have to think about this as this is one type of load we are adding to the grid, but it is part of a multitude of others. So the timing of when it's coming on with others has an implication for what all needs to come on. But think of the grid like a circuit breaker. You turn on too many devices at one time in the room, your breaker goes off, power goes out, and we need to go fix something. The grid's a much more complicated version of that. And so kind of now shifting a little bit to the planning portion of this, and I would say and maybe we're seeing some of my questions come in earlier, I have to think about the timing of when when I say timing, I'm talking about when will it be built and want to use the grid. So if Rivian's saying, hey, I'm going to build a charging depot, I need it in 2 years. That is very important for the utility to know because they need lead time to build that infrastructure for that. It will be localized. So knowing that load is going to show up and what is the guarantee it's actually going to materialize at the levels they say it will materialize at. And that will be a bigger deal, in my opinion, for the medium and heavy duty fleets and less about your individual EVs, because a big depot, while I might build for 100 megawatts, if they only ever use 80 megawatts, I built 20 extra megawatts of infrastructure that might not be needed. And now I have to basically collect that from somebody to get it paid for, and that will get into the rate design here in a minute. And so ways that we can get at this from a planning perspective. When I'm talking about generalized average growth, that would be your and my growth of EVs coming on the grid. That would be something that's easily handled through just utility load forecasting. They should have their economists and other planners looking out at the various individual feeders out there and saying, I think this is how the peak load is going to grow over time. They should be making assumptions about what types are kind of generally what percentage of EV growth is coming on and how that might affect their infrastructure. That is more dispersed. They don't have a lot of knowledge from the individual owners about those vehicles. Maybe they're getting registration data from NDOT. And so that's something that's handled well in kind of just average forecasting. We have a process that we've been standing up called the distribution. And so all the utilities should already be doing this, but we've, from a more public, trying to make our planning process more public, we've been standing up a distribution planning process where parties can come in and say, look at what the utilities are assuming and say, yeah, I think that makes sense. Or, hey, maybe you should think about this and change that. And so that's what the DSP would be really good for. The other form of planning, and this would be very important for our medium and heavy duty fleets, are those who want to install a lot of infrastructure in one very concentrated location. That will probably, I don't say probably, I'm willing to, it will likely require grid infrastructure investment. And I don't want to be making an assumption about where that needs to happen. Or I want to minimize my need for making that assumption because that's what leads to stranded assets. So I'd rather know from these medium and heavy duty people where their facilities need to be, where it needs to be located so that I can focus on building there. And so you have that tug of war between, we know this is coming, we want it to come, but where should it go? And having assurances from these companies that they're going to use that location. So that's how kind of this all ties together. I guess just a quick side note, we talked about this earlier, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. This came up at the first meeting. We did do a previous study, and it was a high level macro look, not a micro look. So it's more for that high generalized study, not about these individual location needs, where we did some projections and said, hey, at least through 2031, we think the level of load growth coming from electrification, which included ACC1 and ACT, is manageable. That was also, as I said, we had to look at this, and you can't look at this in a vacuum. That was before everyone really started incorporating data centers into those projections, which then clearly that now we're operating in a new world where we are now actually operating more on planning margins. That is more at the G&T side than the distribution side, because these data centers aren't probably hooking up directly to that distribution. Sorry, generation and transmission. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. So that's pretty much I think my takeaway here is from a planning perspective, we need to balance preparing for growth that is coming just naturally. We need to, and then being certain about that growth, trying to minimize, we're going to always have error in forecast. That's going to happen. But what can I do to minimize those error bars and ensuring developers know where best to interconnect? Tools that we have for that are distribution system planning process. Our utilities have also been creating hosting capacity maps, which are going to help developers know where they can target on the grid to interconnect. BG&E, I don't have a link here, but BG&E and PHI sent me yesterday links to both of their maps where people can go online and see where the various places are on the grid. From an average perspective, they could it'd be easier for them to interconnect. Also, they've been working with EPRI on a tool that is available to a bunch of these medium and heavy duty fleets. I know they've partnered with people like Amazon and others to basically put a huge database together that's for the United States, looking at this kind of hosting capacity map. That's kind of a one-stop shop for all these OEMs to think about where they should be making investment. So there's a lot of effort trying to educate and get forward knowledge about where these big boys might want to show up. But ultimately, the best approach would be they need to be talking to our utilities and what can we do to make it, hey, you're interested, we want to hear from you. Let's get you in the room now so we can start thinking about where we need to put this infrastructure. So a slight pivot now into general rate design. Obviously, if we make an investment, we need to pay for that investment. And so this is how we're going to do it. In a perfect world, if I do my job perfectly, The price charged to each individual customer should reflect their economic cost of serving them. Basically, I've perfectly figured out what it costs me to get an electron to you. We do follow other certain regulatory principles where that is not exactly matched up, and also the world's is perfect. So we're close to that, but that's the end goal. So effectively, from a payment perspective for EVs, I got two types of cost. I've got the initial upfront cost. That is what's going to happen. And this is what's going to be the biggest barrier for our medium and heavy duty folks. Well, I think it is at least one of the bigger barriers, is the interconnection and upfront cost when they first show up and they say, hey, I want to interconnect. The bigger the megawatt, the bigger capacity they say they need from the grid, likely the more the utility is going to say they're going to need from them to interconnect them. And part of the reason we do that is so what the utilities are doing is they're running a cost test on that, for that request. They're going to say, here's what I think it's going to cost to hook you up to the grid. Here's how much revenue I think I'm going to bring in from you. They're going to do some net present value analysis and say, all right, this is the difference for me to interconnect you to the grid. You need to pay me $500,000 or something like that. And so that would be the upfront interconnection. We call that a cost share. I think there are some interesting ways we maybe could get at that, but that is definitely going to be a barrier for some. The other is just the ongoing cost of being connected to the grid and serving your energy, where your costs are spread across either a fixed charge, where I just charge you the same amount every month, a demand charge, which is based off of how much was your peak usage that month. That's usually reflected in C&I rates. And then the volumetric rate, which is your continuous usage over time. All the customers have a volumetric rate, and residential only pays residential rates. In discussions with parties about rate design, especially on the C&I side, I do see a balance between a balancing act and a tension between cost causation, where I'm trying to say, you pay this much, and here's how I'm going to get it back from you, versus they want simplicity in that rate, which I think that where they just get a single dollar per kilowatt hour charge. And the reason they like that, and people I'm talking about this with, are the charging companies who are effectively just acting as the middleman. They don't want to do the work of translating multiple charges into a volumetric rate that they charge back to you and I, or the charging or the vehicles. And so that has led to some interesting discussions at the commission and proposals, but that has been something that we've seen in this area. So I guess kind of finishing up here. So rate designs, we, the commission, have dealt with on the EV front. We clearly have the standard one I just walked through, but we also do time of use rates. We've had EV specific ones, and we've had whole home ones where, and the whole point of that is I'm going to convince you to passively change your behavior. So I'm not going to take control of your device. Instead, you, the consumer, are going to react to a price signal and change how you charge your car. But you have to take the steps to change your behavior. We've, through the Exelon utilities, been running what's called a smart charge management program, where this is now getting to an active charging program where you plug in, let's say at 5 p.m., but you tell me I don't need to have a full charge on my car till 8 a.m. the next day. They, BG&E, and will take all that information through their contractor and come up with an optimized load curve to basically minimize the demand impact of that and charge everyone's cars so that they meet their time. And so that's a more active approach where you're putting into your device, here's what I need, and that's coming out. To enable time of use and smart charge management for rates specifically for EVs, that has required us, and this is what has limited its applicability to everyone, is the fact that I need specific metering equipment to be able to get that information across. So it works really well with specific vehicle manufacturers who register, and basically the utilities will use your vehicle telemetry in a lot of instances to do these programs. But you, the consumer, have to give access to your vehicle's telemetry to the utility to know that information. Alternatively, we'd have to put a meter in there, but that's really way too expensive probably for normal use. So trying to use the vehicle telemetry has been really important for these programs. I won't talk about demand charge credits. It's a variation on time of use rates. We tried it. We've moved on from it. Didn't work well, or it didn't seem popular. One thing that I was getting to earlier, some of you might have heard about, especially in the C&I side, concerns about us using demand charges, where I'm charging you based off of a single point in time in that month. Where they're having trouble figuring out how to pass that back, or it doesn't give them enough certainty on what their bill is going to be. And so some of the charging companies out there would like to see that be a solely volumetric rate. I actually think that that might make sense when I'm looking at a low usage charger, where it's really not probably even economic to put that charger in that location because not enough people are using it. But a high utilized charger, they should benefit from this because they are now you know what your bill is going to be every month, and you have enough usage that you can now charge a lower rate than your competitor at your charging station. So that one has not progressed further than when it first came to the commission. There were some issues with it. It got sent back and no one ever revived it. Another possible future discussion that's not on here, but things that are coming up in the industry is this idea of flexible interconnection, which is a way to get around the kayak concerns and getting to faster interconnection of chargers onto the grid, where this is being done in California as a pilot. I heard an interesting presentation from them a couple of weeks ago where there have been limited uptake on this. It hadn't been as popular as I assumed it would be, but basically charging companies show up, or not charging companies, but a depot is trying to get built and they're like, hey, I can give you 3 megawatts today. I know you want 10 megawatts in the future. Let's get you hooked up for 3, and we're going to work on building the other 10. But for now, you can at least use some of the infrastructure to get going. And I think that's an interesting approach. I believe we haven't rolled that out here, really been discussed in Maryland, but that's just something I've heard about. So anyways, happy to talk about all this more in depth. I know we're going a little fast. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a choice ahead of us. It is 1:48. Technically, we have 12 minutes left. We have 2 lead discussants who have prepared some remarks. We could go ahead with that and perhaps everyone leaves a little late, or we can call it here and start our next meeting with these lead discussants, which I know is not ideal since we just got this presentation, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So what's the general consensus? Do you guys want to kind of like forge ahead and finish this out, or would you rather hold it for the next meeting?
I'd say go ahead. I mean, provided we end say by like 2:15 or something.
Okay. I have to step out at 2:00 for a meeting that I cannot miss. So I will turn duties over to the secretary to finish out the meeting. But I agree. I think moving ahead it makes the most sense. So with that, Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you as a lead discussant here on the question of how we prepare our grid for EV deployment. And apologies in advance for stepping out a few minutes early. It was great to see all of you, and I will see you all again very soon.
Thank you, Shana.
Thanks.
So I did prepare a few slides. You can go to the next one. So I oversee teams of litigators that work for the Public Service Commission in about 35 states. And I want to try and get a little deeper into some of the things that Ben was just talking about and be more concrete about what the challenge is for developers of charging infrastructure, focusing on plugging in and turning on the charging infrastructure. So backing up, historically, charging infrastructure, the more electricity load, the more electricity, the bigger the facility was going to be. If you build a house, it might be 1 kilowatt. If you build a stadium, it might be 5 megawatts. You build a small town, 20 megawatts. You had the lead time of constructing that to plug it in and turn it on. EV loads are really difficult because it doesn't take much time at all to build an EV charging station for a fleet to start to build a depot. To give you an idea of the scales, if you want to go to the next slide. So a NEVI charger, which is the minimum NEVI size, is about 0.5 megawatt. That's about the half of an average Tesla charging station. It's about 4 trucks depot charging over it. If you go to the next slide, 5 megawatts is much as a big football stadium. That's like a larger Tesla charger station. It's not a huge one, but it's just like a larger one, maybe that you might see in California more often. Or it's 20 to 40 trucks depot charging overnight. A small town, and a city would take like 5 years to build, right? Then you get to a small town that might take a decade plus to build. You compare that to charging 100 school buses to overnight or a highway travel plaza, right? So this is like out in California. You're talking about 19, 20 megawatts. EPRI, which is a think tank, it's sort of a utilities think tank, research think tank. They surveyed their utility members to find out like what kind of what kind of upgrades to your distribution grid would you need and how long is that, what would that take to meet the charging infrastructure needs? So if you want to go to the next slide after that. So basically, this is the type of upgrades that would be needed for a 1 megawatt load, 5 megawatt load, 10 or 20 megawatt load. For a 1 megawatt load, which again is about your typical average Tesla charging station, you would have 6 to 8 chargers. So about 40% of their circuits are going to be fine. Go to the next size, 5. So this is again a larger Tesla station, or you have 20 to 40 trucks depot charging overnight. Only 15% of their circuits can handle that. If you go to a highway charging plaza or a school bus depot with 100 school buses, there are no circuits. Utilities are like, we don't have that bandwidth on our distribution grid. You need upgrades for that. Each of those colored bands is a type of upgrade. It goes from the red, no upgrade, to sort of the beige, which is a whole new substation. So next, EPRI said, well, how long would it take you to do those upgrades? So next slide. So you can see like the minimum upgrade is 6 months, then 6 to 12. So if you go to the next slide, for a 1 megawatt Tesla charging station, which is over 4 to 8 trucks charging overnight, the utilities was not uncommon. It was common for them to say, 1 to 3 years for the type of upgrades we would need on that. So think about that. 1 megawatt Tesla charging station, you talk 8 chargers, maybe 6 to 8 chargers, or 4 to 8 trucks. They're saying utilities, it wouldn't be uncommon to take 1 to 3 years to build out that distribution grid charging. Next slide. If you get to a 5 megawatt Tesla charger or a 20 to 40 truck depot, you're talking about it's 2 to 5 years for the utilities to plug in and turn on your chargers. Nobody is making capital investments and signing contracts for their fleets 5 years out. If you go to the next slide, if you're talking about the school bus, or you're talking about a highway charging plaza, it's 3 to 5 or more years. In California, with certain regulations they just put in place, they have up to 8 years. So this is obviously a huge hurdle. If you go to the next slide, BG&E agrees. These are EPRI's own facts statements, but BG&E says, yeah, right here, right now, in many cases, grid infrastructure upgrades are encumbering fleet EV adoption. Particularly with larger fleets, they face difficulties arising from the concentration of EVs in a few locations. Again, because you get this big load, the loads aren't necessarily in an industrial park or already in an urban area where there might be infrastructure. It could be out where the fleet has been parked for 20 years, a school bus. So next slide. I'm sorry. So these are some of the solutions that other states are implementing and that Sierra Club is advocating the Maryland PSC to adopt in its phase 2 process right now. So if you go to the next slide, the Maryland PSC, we were advocating they could, go ahead, direct utilities to proactively begin to, next slide, do customer outreach, which is what which is precisely what Ben was talking about. Let's not build infrastructure that's not going to be used. Talk to your customers, figure out what the electrification plans are, right? And then proactively plan and upgrade the grid for EV loads. What the typical practice is for many utilities is they wait for a request for service. They find out, they're going to, request for service came in, you can have an office building, we'll start the process 3 to 5 years. But they could say, okay, we anticipate, we've surveyed our people, we understand where the fleets are, we understand the electrification plans of our fleet owners or where they want to put the highway chargers. We can start upgrading the grid now. You want to have contractual protections, but you can actually, the utilities could be told to begin to proactively plan and upgrade their grid for upcoming EV loads to accelerate plugging in and turning on. Next slide. They could stockpile equipment, oddly enough, because just simple transformers on telephone poles right now, their efficiency improvement regulations, they're taking a long time to acquire. So you can stockpile equipment in advance. Next slide. Okay, these are just different policies. Ben was talking about flexible interconnection. You could also have charge management services. Another thing Ben was talking about. Something that a lot of other utilities are starting to do that fleet operators really appreciate are advisory services. Oftentimes utilities will say, customers will say, we don't know who to talk to. There's 5 different people in the utility bureaucracy to try and connect with, and we don't know who to talk to. And luckily I know a guy, right? That's not a good strategy. Yeah, if you look at like DTE, they're a good model up in Michigan. They'll have designated people who sort of shepherd a fleet through. It's a big customer. It's like, they'll shepherd them through the bureaucratic process of the utility, and they can provide other advice. Hosting transparency, Ben talked about already. That's basically letting people know where you have excess room on your grid. Other things the PSC could do, set timetables for interconnecting and energizing chargers. Tell the utilities, how long is it going to take you? Okay, well, we're going to give you 3 years for that type of an upgrade, right? Now, the utilities are not going to like that at all. But what they did in California is they said, okay, and if you can't meet those timetables, you have 3 years. You can correct that. You tell us what you're struggling with. What are the challenges? What are your corrective actions? It doesn't have to be punitive financially or otherwise. They have time to learn and to figure out this new system. Colorado's taking a similar approach. I should say, lots of different flavors of this in different states, but you're seeing New York move on these things, California, Colorado, Washington, New Jersey in their medium heavy duty pilot program. Next slide. The other thing that's going to be really important that I think we should shift to is rate basing the grid upgrades, particularly for one of two things. Public facing infrastructure. It can be cost prohibitive. A lot of times what utilities will say, it's not uncommon for them to have a practice where they'll keep adding things to the grid at relatively no cost. But that one last person who shows up and all of a sudden they have to upgrade the transformer, now that's your $10,000 or your $10 million ticket. When I wanted to put solar panels on my roof, Pepco came back and told me I had to buy a new telephone pole for them and a new transformer, and that was going to be $30,000. So rate basing the grid upgrades, that actually, how much is that going to cost? Next slide. There's plenty of, and revised rate structures that Ben was talking about, there's plenty of empirical data from actual practice in other states and in Maryland that show that if you build out this charging infrastructure, the revenue that you will generate would more than pay for the grid upgrades necessary, which actually ends up meaning you're selling more electricity and bringing in more utility than the cost of those upgrades. That means you're pushing down electricity rates. This is a National Academy of Sciences study right here. That's with load peak impact charging, which means you're shifting load. But here's a retrospective analysis, next slide, of Maryland. In the early days of the Maryland's program, you could see that the costs of the revenues greatly outstrip the costs of the utilities doing the grid upgrades and charging infrastructure. There are scores of studies like this that are out there. It does require managing service, managing charging, and it also depends somewhat on the application. But the point is these are really new challenges for utilities, inconsistent with their former practice, and their former practice worked for decades really well. Number two, there are solutions and there are trials and errors that a lot of states are pursuing. And number three, these are really investments that will drive down the costs, and you'll see a return on those investments over time. So that's my slide set.
That's a lot. Thank you. We will open it up, but I think Ian, you're next.
Well, we're at time, and there was a lot to unpack.
Yeah, but I think, didn't Shane talk
Yeah,
about
so
that?
I mean, I'll just take just a minute to try to not even do a summary, but because it was just so complicated, there's a lot there.
Okay.
I mean, I think one of the issues, right, that is that this is not in a vacuum, right? I think we heard that, right? Electrification and growing demand is happening in, the building space. We know we've got like hyperscale data centers and so we've got to try to keep that in mind. And, the transportation side, right, is a small piece of that. Although localized, it could be really significant, right? So I think it's like trying to get a handle on those local impacts more than sort of the overall sort of, load increases, right, that we're experiencing or we're expecting to experience in the coming years. And then again, the emphasis on peak load, right? So, as much as we can shift that load to off-peak times, that should reduce infrastructure needs and reduce costs. So we should be thinking about how we can do that. I know Ben talked a little bit about some of the work that the PSC is doing to try to incentivize that, some of the pilots. Where can we lean into that load shifting to really, reduce that infrastructure impact, right? And then, in what role is that based on sort of behavioral changes? distributed, they call it like DERs, distributed energy resources. How much can we lean into the solar that's on the grid, the batteries that are hopefully coming online more and more, and try to, you know, attack those. And then even Ben alluded to, but didn't really get into, bi-directional charging. The batteries themselves, what role do they play in sort of reducing those impacts? I think those are all challenges and opportunities that we can be sort of thinking about as we approach this challenge. That work?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I know we're at time, and we have a flex of 15 minutes if you want it, or I guess what, yeah. If you think of
I really appreciated, Ben, your presentation, and Josh, yours as well. I think kind of from, you know, perspective of someone who, you know, spent 8 years building DC fast charging stations, the world hasn't necessarily changed in the last 15 years. It hasn't necessarily gotten easier anywhere. It's that the industry has figured out how to navigate it. And so like, it's fine. But and what I want to say is I think that there's room from this working group to suggest some way, kind of a nuanced pathway forward on this issue. Obviously, anyone who works in DC charging obviously always wants everything faster. But that industry has kind of found its own feet. They figured out how to navigate this. How does the state help, you know, more, I guess, kind of the newcomers, right? The fleet adopters, the multi-unit dwelling residents. Ben, something that you said during your presentation, like really, like the moment you said it, I was like, oh boy, like Rivian says, oh, we're going to want load in 2 years. We're going to want load in 2 months. And it's not going to be us, right? It's going to be one of our customers. And if our customer can't get access to that, they're just going to buy more gas-powered vehicles, more diesel vehicles. And so it's imperative on, you know, the state of Maryland, to the degree that it can, to help those would-be adopters kind of have their needs met. And so there's not going to be a cookie cutter, one size fits all to address everybody's needs. But if there are specific communities and populations that Maryland wants to kind of see adopt this technology, how can we aim the, you know, the power of the government to help them, right? And, you know, asking utilities to turn around everything within 2 months, it's obviously not going to be reasonable. But are there specific applications where we could direct the utilities to try and be more helpful? Yes. So for what that's worth.
Secretary, this is a great slide, Josh. I've never seen it presented so sort of clearly to understand sort of the time length. My question is actually for both Ian and Ben. At the beginning, when we heard from Atlas, they talked about how, you know, 2030, 2031, it's less than 1% impact to the ACT relative to kind of the electricity demand increase. But then we got to between 5 and 6%, depending on whether it was peak or not. Does that scare you or not? Because I see that number and I don't know if that's frightening, right? But you know it in the context of, like you're mentioning, data centers and other demands. So I have no context for, is that a lot for you guys?
I think that what was interesting about that slide to me that it's not even highlighted is our current peak load is 14 to 15 gigawatts. So 14 to 15,000 megawatts. That gray bar that he has in there is starting 3,000 megawatts above where our peak is today. That's a lot of load there that he's not even including in this discussion. I said we have to look at the whole discussion. So I do think it is a challenge. But I think what was the tougher nut or the tougher thing to crack is going to be that orange picture where he was talking about the transient charging. Because to me, depot, we can probably as a group think about, and getting to Bo's statement about like, what can we target and work with? I think depot charging, we can definitely think about what programs can we do to help convince end state use cases, and how can we plan for them, because we know they're going to be going from point A to point B. Trying to think though about infrastructure investment for people who are just starting in state, or they're like, we're just going through the state. Trying to think of the business case for that, making sure that they think they can make enough revenue and avoid a stranded cost on the ratepayer side is something that I think is going to be a tougher policy thing for us to think through how we solve for that. I don't know if Josh has a view on that, but but to your question, yes, I think that is something on our side we all have to think through, and that's definitely what we're all wrestling with on the energy side of the business. Is as this peak load keeps growing, what can we do to serve that load growth as cost effectively as possible? Because we're all hearing about rates already, and so anything where I've been taking risk about stranded assets or building too much, like some of the ideas Josh was putting out there, where yes, that could help with some of this, but you're asking us to take a risk in an environment where I don't know that the ratepayer wants us to be taking that risk right now. So we need to think through which of these is actually a tenable policy suggestion today versus is that something we need to think about? Maybe that's a little later down the road. I don't know, but it's, I don't know if that's answering your question or helping.
No, it absolutely does. So a little perspective is also helpful. They say timing is everything.
Yeah.
This is a 5.9% increase in peak load in 2050. Right. So 25 years ago was 1995. That was a really different world from I was law school. That shouldn't be terrifying to a country as advanced as the United States. How would you meet a 5% increase of power demand over the next 20 years? Also, the thing about EV loads is that if you're not talking about the DCFC fast charging and route loads, it's very malleable time, right? And you can really sort of displace. So I think that to me, and I think a lot of studies I've read indicate it's not the total peak load. The difference between data centers and EV load, and I mean, I just on a panel with Duke execs, and the difference between the two things is data centers are saying we want a gigawatt of power and we want it in 12 to 18 months and we want it here. Whereas EVs are much more incremental, much more distributed, right? Number one. Number two, the data center load is much more sort of geographically oriented in certain places. And I don't mean to be redundant, but I'm like, we're seeing a lot of it in Virginia, a lot of it in a couple other states, Maryland, not so much, although we're tied to PJM. I would say two other things. When you think about risk of stranded assets, there's an opportunity price and a cost to caution. Right now, Maryland is seeing, like a lot of PJM, our energy rates skyrocket because of our deference to PJM and to energy markets. We were too timid to actually step in and do homegrown energy generation here, storage here. We didn't get enough, so we have capacity shortfalls. And that's an example of paying an opportunity cost because we weren't making the investments we need to. I think that we're looking at the same kind of a thing. Empirically, we're showing that these type of investments in charging infrastructure, in the distribution grid, more than pay for themselves. So that should mitigate some of that risk for us, number one, or concern about the risk. And number two, we should be learning from what we just did with PJM, and we're still trying to figure our way out of the woods. So we don't replicate that on the distribution grid. If we know that we can make investments now, and it will lower prices over time for everybody, we should be making those investments, especially when you look at the cost. What the studies suggest are the costs initially up front. They're incredibly modest. A lot of them can be covered by some of the federal funding we have.
Okay, we have 5 minutes if there are any other questions. Or none in here. Online.
Just one thing is for Lou, like for anyone who's in the EV, I think, and that's where I was like, this opportunity cost and timing. I think having reliable and I've kind of asked, like, what do we think the market's going to do with the new course correction from the federal government? The more we can understand more certainly where this might be going, then yes, you can start having this discussion about opportunity costs and building out infrastructure. But the more up and down that is, Yeah, no, I think that's what makes that opportunity cost harder to figure out. Because I mean, we had a goal of what, 300,000 cars by 2025. And that's kind of now shifted. And if I had built for that, you all would have probably said, Ben, what are you doing? So I think that's part of the calculus that we have to talk through and think about when we're talking the planning side. It's not that we don't take some of this opportunity cost risk, but I think it's just trying to make sure we have the right numbers backing it up.
No, that's a great point. I will add though, that if you look at the map in this handout of where Maryland currently has highway charging, it's basically in a very limited area around urban areas. So maybe the reason why we're not at 300,000 vehicles is that if you're like me and you have an EV, I can't take my EV out to Western Maryland and charge it on the highway reliably. I can do it in Virginia. I can't go out to the Eastern Shore and reliably charge it. With the NEVI money, if we build those stations on time, all of a sudden, I can go and use my EV for all the use applications I would use it for my kids' travel teams, et cetera. I can't do that right now because we don't have those chargers. So would we be at 300 if we had been, building out our highway charging grid more robustly? Maybe. But I do appreciate it. I work with the Office of People's Counsel a lot. I do appreciate their perspective and your perspective, and I think it's really important. I pay my rates too.
Okay, I have to open it up very quickly, though. Is there anyone online who'd like to ask a question that we may not be able to answer by 2:15, but you can at least get your questions out? All right, I think people are ready to go. Okay, well, thank you on behalf of Shayna and everybody else. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right.